still visible in our media, our literature, our governance, our policies, and our archives. So remarkably, history has no blank pages because it's always alive. The Presbyterian Church USA has historians on staff, and thank you, PHS, to ensure that collective knowledge of our institutional life lives on. We have agency historians to ensure that the appropriate care of the collective knowledge of our church is taken care of. And here's a way to look at it. So up on the surface of what we see every day, progress is marching on by, very outward looking, but it does reveal things like resilience, advocacy, complicity, moral questions, intergenerational conflict, and tons of stereotypes. But underground, at the roots, history can reside in a very sedated and screened storage environment. It's always waiting in the recesses to be seen, to be able to reveal greater truths. History is our collective memory. And it doesn't just bear witness to a dead past. It's also an exploration of knowing how some see the world and how the world sees them. So visibility is survival. Autonomy is survival. Sovereignty and self-declared identity is survival. Our ways of knowing these lessons ground us in our diversity and what truth speaks for us. Storytelling is a very important thing in our Indigenous community. But I have to tell you that winter is the appropriate time for storytelling, and we're past that now. So I'm going to urge us tonight to be very cautious and mindful of those Indigenous traditions, and to be extremely respectful as we talk about records and relics that have shaped our lives, because we have to treat history as a living presence of survival, imagination, and revelation. How do we assure that we need to keep our collections of memory open? I come from a people who have faced genocide and who always have been lied about. That's why I chose this t-shirt to wear tonight, which says, "My DNA is not," can you see it? Oh, my culture, I'm sorry, is not a DNA test. And my history is also not a specimen that you put in a jar and close the lid. Because what happens if no one remembers the stories of my people and their names and their dates? So I ask you as Presbyterians, what is the spiritual discipline inherent in our retention policies? I'm going to ask the stated clerks that, because we know you should all have a retention policy that you're matching up every year when you do the sharing of your reports. But have you ever said, what is our spiritual discipline in this process? Are we serious about decolonizing the categories and the chronologies of our record keeping and our relationships? We must see ourselves not only as we are today, that outward looking up on the surface, but we need to see ourselves through time, shaped by relationships, by definitions, and cultural norms that actually preceded us. And then there were moments of time that came before what we think is our beginning. History always calls us to go back and retrieve the lessons and the wisdom from the past, because truth exists beyond our present time. Now, some of you know when Gregory and I were co-moderators, we talked a lot about Sankofa. That's the African practice of being able to say, through an image of a bird that's moving forward, but looking back with an egg in her beak. It's an ideological and cultural practice that's a wonderful example of reaching back to carry wisdom of the past, to find those things that were important to your survival, and bring them forward with you into the future. That egg in the Sankofa bird's mouth is a container of complicated relationships that in our historical society work and as Presbyterians, we often only see as maybe printed words or images or objects. But that wisdom will always be a container of truth and influence, an inventory, things that are masks. It may be a container of erasure versus visibility. And it's a container of chronology and genealogy. So I urge the Presbyterian Historical Society to make Sankofa a healing practice, a standard of acknowledging the past, creating categories that will help future generations navigate and engage more deeply. Because Sankofa will be a way to honor and immortalize the very harvest of our centuries together. We need to commit to reinforce interaction between collections and communities. And Nancy, thank you for raising that already. I just love that. One of the Dakota teachings is that we will be known forever by the tracks we leave. This comes from a culture that has a lot of hunters, and that's how you follow what you're looking for, is by the tracks that are left behind. Treat them as lessons of opportunities, our interaction, our relationship, and our history. These are lessons to be seen, recognized, and valued, not just as artifacts, or if people are involved as caricatures or exhibits. History and its truths spread across and circumvent, as Presbyterians, all of our reports, our books, our newsletters, our art objects, our handwritten letters, our photographs, and the collectibles, and I don't know all what else you might have in your building, but we know, like in our own offices, what we have, right? But those things cannot be understood outside of their interrelatedness with one another and where they came from, their creators, and all the church's space that we use to store or hoard history. Collectively, they are a dynamic legacy, forming and reforming and transforming our unique connection to the past through conversation and Sankofa endurance. Transporting our collections and donations from across generations is an immensely valuable truth-telling process so that we can detox and unpack the narratives that we carry. So looking back and lifting up the truth moves us beyond just being curious to being accountable and to be transformed. History is not just a checkoff list of events centered around contact with colonial settlers, and I was born and raised in Philadelphia. I tell people, You know, I walked on cobblestone streets, Bessie Ross was just down the street, and the Liberty Bell was right there with every school trip. But my people's history preceded what happened in colonial Philadelphia. We're Delaware and Nanticoke. We were there when the ships arrived. So let's give voice to educate and advocate for justice in all of our collections, to protect our identities from exploitation, from underrepresentation, harmful, exclusionary, and derogatory terminology, and to preserve the truth from stories within us. So I close by asking you, how do we see ourselves? And what is it that we really care about? What has value for us to carry into the future? Let's work together to build new categories of knowledge in our terminology, in our chronology, our theology, our polity, our sociology, our archaeology. I'm very much looking forward to tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I am going to introduce both Tim and the panelists so we can move fairly quickly into the panel. And I'm going to start with Tim Hoogland. He directed education programs at the Minnesota Historical Society for over 30 years. He is drawing on the David Sindt papers for this presentation, and those were transferred to the Presbyterian Historical Society in 2019 as part of our larger Pam Byers Memorial Collecting Initiative. And we started that started talking about it in 2016, wanting to fill gaps in our collection. And so David Sindt papers were transferred in 2019. And what Tim has done is created various curriculum presentations for both youth and adults about that historic fight for LGBTQ inclusion in the Presbyterian Church. And before I go on, I forgot to say there's a program on all the tables, and there's a longer biography of everyone there. So I'm going to direct you to that as well. And then on our panel tonight, I'm so happy that Reverend Lisa Largess is here. She serves as the parish associate at Lake Nokomis Presbyterian Church in Minneapolis, and as the outreach coordinator for state services for the blind of Minnesota. Her quest to be ordained as an out queer Presbyterian spanned 3 decades, from 1986 to her ordination as a minister of Word and Sacrament in 2016. Terry McEwen is also joining us. Terry, there you are. He is a member at Westminster, a retired elementary school teacher, and he is a leader in this congregation. He's served as a deacon, and he is a leader in the LGBTQ affinity group here. In 2014, on their 30th anniversary as a couple, Terry married his husband Rick here at Westminster, and it was the first same-sex wedding performed at this church. And finally, Dr. Pei Ng is the third person on the panel. She is a professor of mathematics at the University of Minnesota Morris and is also currently serving as the acting vice chancellor for academic affairs and a dean. Pei has been very active with More Light Presbyterians and was also a lay leader at Dayton Avenue Presbyterian Church in St. Paul. So, Tim, please tell us much more about David Sindt and this long movement for full inclusion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, and welcome for everybody coming out tonight. We've been looking forward to this for a long time, and it's kind of representative as some of the things Nancy talked about and Alona was calling us to about working with archives and then trying to work with that material to come out and start to have conversations, oftentimes critical conversations, that those materials can lead us into. So, just telling you a little bit about myself, you heard from Nancy, is I've been a public historian and taught at the University of Minnesota for a number of years, and I ended up on the Presbyterian Historical Society board while I was on a 1970 school bus going down the middle of nowhere road in Cuba when Tim Hart Anderson knows that I just retired, and he says, "I've got something for you," which turns out to be on the board of the Presbyterian Historical Society. So that's where my journey with PHS began. But I think it's also important, in doing history presentations, to know a little bit about me. I am not an expert on LGBTQ history at all. I was working on a PhD in U.S. foreign relations and then ended up running youth programs for 30 plus years and doing other things. So like any story, you only know little bits of it and you're kind of connected to it in one way or another. But as a straight white male historian, I have limited perspective on these things, and I'm deeply indebted to the LGBTQ affinity group here at Westminster who saw the prototype of this presentation and informed it greatly. So thanks for that, and thanks for all of you who found your way here tonight, and thanks to the Hennepin History Museum for helping to promote this event, which has context here in Hennepin County as well. So, and Alona was talking about a lot of great things related to how you think about history and different ways to come at it, especially at a time where we live in a world that's filled with alternative facts and truthiness and all kinds of other stuff. So that is also why, as I go through the presentation, you have this booklet in front of you, which we will go through. I'll ask you to turn the different tabs of the booklet, and you will see some of the documents that this presentation was built on and are in the collections of the Presbyterian Historical Society. So I'll tell you when to turn the tabs. You'll get the cue on that. But I think it also talks about the definition of history. Most people, why should I study history? A lot of times, well, you got to study history so you don't repeat the mistakes of the past. That assumes that the past is all a mistake, which not necessarily is. So my kind of running definition of studying history is really understanding that history is the connectedness of all things in the human experience, right? When I started working at the Historical Society, I met Rick, when he was working on exhibits there, and there's a lot of different things about a story like LGBT inclusion that I think everybody in this room is going to find their connection to it. It's hard not to. And so I'll get to some of that for myself as well. So this is a kind of a shorter version of what I presented to Terry and Rick and Phil, the group here a while back, but I'm hoping that it's going to get us to a good conversation later on with our panel as well. So I think we should just dive in. And oftentimes these stories emerge when organizations or individuals reach these times of choosing. And that has happened multiple times with the Presbyterian Church, right? If you start looking at this list of things that we could be dealing with about how the church split over slavery in the Civil War, about the ordination of women, that different Reformed denominations are still working their way through, right? And the decline of mainline denominations of all kinds, right? Then, when reunion happened for the Presbyterian Church, it thought, wow, we're all back together again, maybe. All right, we'll get to that later. And then kind of the latest struggle within the church, LGBTQ inclusion. And just so you know, since we're spanning about 50 plus years of dealing with this, the acronyms go all over the place in historical documents. So we're just kind of sticking with LGBTQ, and you'll see some of these things kind of flow and evolve as well. So our story, when I first engaged this, begins in June of 1974 at the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, the United Presbyterian Church USA, when in the middle of this great gathering, a young pastor stands up and holds up a sign. And I'm going to go way out on a limb. I'm going to guess that this is pretty gutsy for 1974. Just saying, right? And when I first learned, I knew that this little story that I had read in some of the PHS stuff was just really the tip of a pretty big iceberg in seeing where this goes. Like, who is this guy? And how did this all play out? And so if you open tab 1, you're going to see the beginnings of the revolution, okay? And this is the first, I think, newsletter of what was then going to be the Gay United Presbyterians, the GUP. And, if I was doing this in adult ed, we'd spend more time reading through these documents a little bit more. But in this case, we're just giving you a flavor, and you are free to take these books with you, and the QR code that's on the front will take you to the PHS collections, to the David Sindt collections, right? But what he says lower down on the first page is that what they're planning to do is what he calls a ministry of presence at the General Assembly in Louisville in 1974, which you got to see an example of what the ministry of presence was going to be. And you'll also see that he's building on a foundation that there are other LGBTQ affinity groups in like the United Church of Christ. This isn't the first time that this has happened, and that they are determined to reform the church from within. They are not going to leave the denomination, that they are going to kind of bring the church along. And you can also see that great revolutions back in the day were run with typewriters, okay? And requests for envelopes and postage and all the other things that you need to have to run a revolution in the 70s, okay? But before we dig deeper in the story of where this all came, I think it's always good just to take a step back and just look at the roots of any specific issue. And I think when you're looking at the gay rights movement, right, a lot of people think, somehow the church exists outside of it or some way, but the church is really just a reflection of what's going on in the bigger world. It doesn't live in this magical church fishbowl that is not affected by what's on the outside. And I think that's how you have to understand what's going on with somebody like David Sindt. And even within understanding different issues of the LGBTQ rights movement, it didn't just happen with Stonewall. It's the next slide, right? But there were advocates working for things like the Mattachine Society, that if you were discovered to be a homosexual working for the federal government, you were fired immediately. And these were federal employees trying to get employment rights, because it assumed that you were a security risk if you were a homosexual back then. So that's even back in the 1950s. And, just historically, right, you're looking at centuries or more, especially within the Western context of, the stigmas related to homosexuality and conversion therapies and other, ways to basically try to bring homosexuals back to some perceived state of normal. And all of the just almost genocidal effects of that kind of policy in the church also being at the root of that as well. And then 1969 rolls around, and the Stonewall Rebellion initiates the evolution of what's going to unfold outside these windows here shortly, with Pride rapidly expands across the country. And like a lot of things in the 70s coming out of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, all these other things, LGBTQ rights become a topic of conversation, and this is something that also is going to flow into the church. And when you look at this, the church, especially a good Presbyterian church, is going to organize a task force to study and discern. And this is a report from 1970 where the church is acknowledging that they lack an understanding of homosexuality, and that they are trying to figure out how are they going to approach this in terms of some sort of process of understanding and change within the church, and also realizing that that is also going to get a reaction as well. And so on top of that comes the American Psychiatric Association, right? In 1973, when they removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders, right? And this is a gay newspaper that says 20 million gay people cured instantly. You just change one thing in the diagnostic manual, and it's, a whole new world, a story unto itself. But as Alona also alluded to, if you go down these roads of change, there are going to be forces of change that are going to be pushing back against that. And this brings us to Anita Bryant and the Save Our Children campaign, which was a reaction to LGBTQ human rights ordinances in Florida, I think in Dade County. And this campaign ended up becoming a national effort, especially in the evangelical community, to push back against a lot of these recognitions of human rights for LGBTQ people across the country. And you will see that the terminology used in this 1976 campaign are the same words that were being used, the things that homosexuals can only, if they can't reproduce, then they have to go groom, and all these terms that are just loaded with hate and bigotry under the disguise of righteousness in the way that you look at it, right? And so as I kind of got to this stage in the story, I'm trying to think about, within the Presbyterian context, how do you initiate this reform movement, right? How do you fight the revolution? And I kind of isolated this into like three P's, right? You got to have positions, okay? And these are the things like, what do you believe and what are the foundations of those beliefs? And since this is something that's evolving within the church, naturally these are going to, have a foundation in Scripture. And so I think these are things that Tim Hart Anderson referred to as, at least in this context, the clobber passage. Things that you can take right out of the Bible and just whack people with them, right? And so when you get into Paul's letter to the Romans, you can see how this is like the place where you can go and find these biblical foundations for discrimination. And on the other hand, Tim also described that this wasn't always just a polity battle. You really were battling for hearts and minds and trying to put Scripture through what I think he called the love test. Did you call it the love test? I think you did, right? And there are variations of this, of loving your neighbors as yourself, okay? And so now positions are kind of set, and any position, will only be advanced if you have passion and the willingness to fight for what you believe in. And there's a number of people in this room that, were part of that battle. And then the more boring part is the polity, right? And that you have to address the issues of the governing structures that you're trying to change to be in support of your position. And it was a very, very big divide. And the question was, how are you going to bridge this in some degree? So if you want to, you can go ahead and open up tab 2 on there. And this will move us forward in time a little bit, because the Gay United Presbyterians, GUP, has now become the PGC, the Presbyterian Gay Caucus, okay? And you can see that in addition to typewriters, you need Scotch tape and scissors to run your revolution here. And so you've got some stuff from the General Assembly Daily News that is pretty lengthy, but gets at the basics that the General Assembly still feels like they need, and you'll see the term in there, more light, right? They still need to study this, but there's an acknowledgement here that it's obvious that the expressions of homosexuality are inherently sinful, right? And you also see in this document, like a lot of the denominations, is evolving. The idea is that you have to hate the sin but love the sinner, right? And this is how, not quite, don't ask, don't tell, but it's kind of heading down this path. And you'll also see there's a minority report with the scriptural arguments kind of embedded down the right. So this is kind of a mixed bag as the church is wrestling with these topics at this time, where they're still looking for more discernment, and but still difficult for them to bridge, I think, the perceived scriptural divide. And so, if you go to tab 3, got a couple of quick tabs for you here. You can see the representation of this just a couple years later, and you've got kind of dueling newsletters within the Presbyterian Church. On the left side, you'll see you have a newsletter from now the more light Presbyterians who are aligned with the Presbyterian Gay Caucus and talking about ways that they are doing outreach. And on the other side is the Presbyterian Charismatic Communion. So let's look and see kind of what they have to say. In the Presbyterian Charismatic Communion, it's like, no Presbyterian church should ordain about homosexual ministry. God's mercy and strength are more than enough to liberate an individual, right, from any sin that she might have, or he or she might have. And then over on the more light side of things, they're starting to see more people coming out to meetings to learn more about the issue, right? Is it still going through this process of discernment? At the same time, the Presbyterian Charismatic Communion, in there, you talk about they're committing $12,000 to a publishing venture with a booklet entitled Healing for the Homosexual, which is being mailed to every ordained UPC USA and PCUS minister within the United States. Okay, that's 1978. $12,000 is a lot of money in 1978. Okay, so it's within this that, you know, we're going to kind of reconnect here with people, specifically our friend David Sindt. Okay, just a Minnesota kid who grew up in the Twin Cities, not far from here initially, on Franklin Avenue, and we learned through the providence that goes with putting these things together. PHS got an email from his sister, who's still alive, thanking us for doing this presentation and letting us know that David and his sister attended Sunday school at Westminster in the early 50s, and before he went off, and later attended a church in North St. Paul, right? And then he was called to ministry, and I think he comes from a family with a history of Presbyterian pastors, and was ordained in 1965, okay? And in 1972, you know, he had moved to Chicago and was working in social work and had done some ministry, but now was an out gay pastor. And the church in Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church in Chicago was trying to organize a ministry to the LGBT community in Chicago. And they were asking for David Sindt to be called to that ministry, which means he needed approval, right? And one of these things, as we were working on this project over the past few years, we wondered, we know that he gave this sermon and we had papers and records, but we had to call back to Chicago and said, hey, is there a recording of, you know, anything? I know that Westminster has lots of reel-to-reel tapes, right? And they said, we don't know. Well, they went and looked, and they did. And they have the sermon that David Sindt preached about this proposal. And so this is an excerpt of that sermon digitized.
Would also introduce the Reverend David Sindt, who is on my left, who has been extended a call by this session to work part-time in establishing a ministry to the gay community. And we've asked him to preach today in order that he might lay before us the implications and meanings of the church's ministry to the homosexual community.
The church, from its very earliest times, has chosen to perpetuate some of Paul's insights into practical advice for survival, and it's chosen to judge, to exclude, to label, to harass, to persecute, to oppress, to torture, and to kill, rather than to liberate, to be open, to include, to support, and to love. Every author who writes today on gay issues, if he talks about the subject at all, points to the church as a primary source, even the primary source of the condemnation of gay people, of homosexuals. Now, if on examining our consciences we find that such condemnation is invalid, and we have a responsibility earned over 2,000 years to right the wrongs we have perpetuated on millions and millions of gay men and women. If we're going to have such a ministry, we cannot have it, however, in our tradition of help to the poor unfortunates. We can't do this because we don't know who gay people are. James Baldwin makes some remarks in regard to another equally oppressed minority that are helpful in our consideration. He points out how much better black people know whites than whites know black. How therefore whites trapped by our history cannot free ourselves, that we must be freed by blacks. Let's look at gay people. We gay people know the straight world. We play its games every day of our lives. We were raised in straight families. We were taught in straight schools. We know it better than straight people even, because in so many cases our very existence has depended on that. So our gay ministry in Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church is necessarily a mutual ministry. We gays need us churchmen to support our struggle for freedom, to undercut the religious basis for anti-gay prejudice and discrimination. And we churchmen need us gays to show us how to free ourselves from our sexual and human bondage, to help us learn once again to be human, to be loving again, and free of our sexually stereotyped roles. When I'm driving a car full of gay people to some event and I don't know the way, I often have to ask, which direction do we go? Sometimes the answer is straight ahead, to which the response invariably is not straight ahead, gaily forward, which is, I think, a very good direction to go. Amen.
And I did check to see if that is like the longest running gay humor joke. It turns out I think it is. So it was very empowering for us to hear David Sindt's voice since we were working this in the abstract, within the documents. And this was in an earlier version of the presentation. We wouldn't even have any of these materials if they hadn't been the efforts of one individual at Lincoln Park not to throw them away. David Sindt was not a sorter. He was a piler. And you found this pile. Not to mention that's a risk for any historical document, but when you're talking about communities on the margin, the existence of these documents represented some individual and collective danger to the community, it's even more of a blessing to have these things to work with. So go ahead and open up tab 4, and we will find out what happened to the request to open up this ministry. Okay. So they're coming in from the Presbytery of Chicago. Shockingly, the answer is no. Although it had some positive, the Committee on Ministerial Relations does not recommend, underlined, right, that final clearance be given to the Reverend David Sindt that he can accept a call to Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church for a specialized ministry of the gay community, right? And part of this rationale is that it's important that the minister not himself be himself an advocate of homosexual. It's so that you would not want a gay minister working with the gay community. Okay, so, but the battle continues, realizing, right, this is, look at the date, 1973, and when was the General Assembly? 74. So he had done this initial outreach and things and gotten the stone wall, right? And next comes the Ministry of Presence at the General Assembly, which initiated, an ongoing process with the church. And here is an image of his testimony to a task force that, at that time ultimately recommended ordination, gay ordination, right? But was not approved, in the presbyteries and whatnot. But he talks about how he prays to this committee not relegate him to second-class citizenship, which is inherent in the idea of hating the sin and loving the sinner, right? And so the best part about this document, too, his testimony is written on the back of a lava lamp advertisement. Okay. And so as you start moving through this, there's another wrinkle in here with reunion. In 1983, the churches reunite. You can see in tab 5, this is the New York Times article. Basically, it says that the schism within the Presbyterians was the longest running one. Some of the other denominations had put themselves back together again earlier than that. But they're talking about how they're going to be able to come together and gradually do this, but, I learned more of the details, at least, that there is an out clause for the Southern Church coming back in, that if they didn't like it after X number of years, is it 10 years or 15 years? John or Tim, who knows? 15, they could exit with their property, okay? At the same time, then, if you're reuniting with the Southern Church, which is inherently going to be more culturally conservative than what's going on in the Northern churches and things like that, you are, bringing maybe a more conservative element into this ongoing debate over LGBT inclusion, okay? And it's pretty clear sides get drawn, right, in this. On the inclusionists, on one side, you see some of the organizations there, Presbyterians, Gay Leaders of Concern, more like Covenant Network, All May Freely Serve, all in there, and then exclusionists, the Presbyterian Laymen, Presbyterian Coalition, Presbyterians for Renewal, Presbyterians for Pro-Life, right? There's a lot of stuff that's going to go on, right? And because I've been forced to cut this thing, it's pretty much like I have to say, and then lots of things happened, right? So I'm not going to get into a lot of the polity stuff, but there was a moment in time that I think was pretty significant. This is also from the PHS collections at the General Assembly in 1991, where the increasingly growing advocacy group for LGBT inclusion was able to stage this.
I would ask you as the commissioners to join and to pray and to care for those individuals of our time who feel their lives are a testimony of hope as they continue to struggle for justice. They've asked me if they may make a silent statement of who they are as a witness to the breadth of the family of God, while there is still this kind of uncertainty and deep passion in regard to the issues that have been before this assembly.
And as you start to then go through the 90s, positions are still hardening in some ways, and then rules are made. So here you have Amendment B, where you see in bold the requirement either to live in fidelity with the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman or chastity and singleness, okay, for being ordained. And this is my slide where lots of things happened. And so 15 years of struggle going back and forth, organizing, advocating, and a lot of people in this room working on that. And really coming up with this protracted battle over the Book of Order and Church Governance. And if you open up tab 6, you'll see the response to Amendment B was Amendment A, which doesn't talk about sexuality. It talks more about service to the church and the love of Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord, and the approval of their communities and congregations in their service, right? But within that time frame, there were penalties for being out of order, right? Jane Sparr, probably a revolutionary on the same par as David Sindt, is doing things in same-sex marriages and being called into church courts, right? And penalties can be up to being defrocked and losing your ministry, right? And so this is kind of a moment in time where this story comes back to Minneapolis. If you open up tab 7. And this is an article from the Star Tribune about Pastor Erwin Barron, a pastor here at Westminster. The connection to us is Erwin baptized our youngest daughter here, and a few other people as well. And so you can read the article about an anonymous accuser who accused him of being engaged when he was in California with a marriage ceremony. And you can see the date here. We're getting pretty close to having the time when this is resolved within the PCUSA. And to have to go through this, you can see Westminster members were there to support him in this. And on the side, Erwin also participated in the Shower of Stoles project, where a lot of LGBTQ ministers, if they left the ministry, would send their stoles to go on display with something they had written, and a lot of them anonymously, right? And this is Erwin's stole that he later allowed to be acknowledged to be his, and a statement on the side, which he talks about. I don't always read PowerPoints, but I'm going to read this one. That as an honest, loving, partnered gay man, I cannot be your pastor. I cannot wear this stole. I do not fit your view of morality, your exclusive club. So I must leave the Presbyterian ministry with tears and regret, but leave I must, sending the stole as my witness. And so I think it kind of gives you a sense, these kinds of objects beyond documents, of the depth of what's going on in people's lives and their commitment to the church. And, but right on the heels of this, in 2011, Amendment A, the Book of Order is changed, and then a lot of things happen on the heels of that. And so then you start looking to the future a little bit more in this new reality after all this being realized, right? And the question we have here with us tonight is like, what's David Sindt's legacy? And this is some things that we're going to ask the panel to talk about, as they have experienced some of this as well. And if you see inclusion ordained here, Bertram Johnson ordained in 2014, first openly gay African-American man to be ordained. And on the right is Lisa Largess. And Nancy talked about her. I think someone in the Zoom call called it an odyssey of on her way to her ordination here, in this very lovely photo of that ordination in 2016. And here's Inclusion Blessed. Here's Rick and Terry. Terry, I'm pretty sure that you demanded that I put this photo in this presentation. There was an email. But a tremendous moment, and if I think there was, it was all hands on deck in the pastorate to make sure that they were able to participate in this ceremony, right? And you can see the slogan here, for our friends from the Morelight Presbyterian movement here, and Alex McNeil in there as well, that this David Sindt legacy was a thread that kind of came through all this too. But I'm going to have you open up tab 8. All right. And here we've spent all this time talking about all these things that are happened, but this is not something that David got to see to the end, right? Because while this church drama is playing out that we've been focused on tonight, the AIDS crisis is also unfolding. You can see that David passed away in a very loving way, surrounded by his community in Chicago, right? And he was inducted into the LGBTQ Hall of Fame in Chicago. And they talked about this. He said, though gregarious, outspoken, and always available for advice or help, Sindt lived alone. His friends at Lincoln Park Presbyterian Church formed a team to care for him in his West Lakeview house during the last months of his life. Each evening, someone prepared dinner and they shared the meal. The Lincoln Park Church continues the ministry by taking a Sunday evening meal to the residents of the Chicago House facility. His memory continues to inspire service to the community. And although you don't get to see pieces of it very often, the AIDS quilt, there actually were 2 panels made for David Bailey Sindt, and you can see very prominently is an iris. So if you look in the back of the room, we have 2 arrangements of irises. And one of his many gifts is he was a 4-H kid living in the city, learning how to crossbreed irises. Who knew, right? So he passed 25 years before the ultimate resolution of this. And you can just see all the different things on his quilt panel about the service that he had made to his community. But that legacy is real and meaningful.
When I look at the church and the work that needs to be done, sometimes it feels impossible. But I also remember a time when being a openly bisexual Black woman minister felt impossible. But I did that. And I was able to do that because I grew up seeing these LGBTQIA people within the church living and working and teaching and claiming their place at the table, because it's not any one person's table, it's God's table. And so I know that nothing is impossible through God because I've seen their stories.
And ultimately, there is this question of where do we go from here? This is still an issue that has the church has had to address, related to churches having left and some still leaving the PCUSA over issues like this. And so to close this presentation, I wanted to give the stated clerk, J. Herbert Nelson, kind of the last word here in terms of how he feels after all this that he's gone through, where the PCUSA is today.
We are affirming of all individuals who come into the life of our church. We affirm the fact that LGBTQ persons are persons created in the likeness and image of God. And we are deeply grateful that they stayed in this denomination through many of the struggles and floor fights of our denomination over whether or not their presence was worthy or accepted in the life of the church. And we're grateful because they taught us something. They took us back to the scriptures that reminded us that the Lord loves us all. I'm so thankful. As a person who grew up in South Carolina, a segregated environment, that once again the church began to open its doors, not just simply to those of us who are locked up or struggling with the issues of race, but those who were struggling with the issue of gender and sexuality. We're an open church. We're a loving church. And yes, we are also a church that is fault-filled. I'm glad that we at least come to a place where some of our faults, we've been able to take it to the Lord and find a different way.
And so that concludes what I have now, and we're gonna transition to the panel here. But I'm going to ask you to do one thing, since this is really the first time that PHS has kind of done this kind of thing with these materials. On your tables, there's either a paper or you can use a QR code. Before you leave here tonight, please fill out this quick little survey so that we can kind of get a feel for how you reacted to this presentation and this program. So you can hold that for a little bit. But now I'm going to bring Nancy back up. We're going to assemble the panel. My job is to turn on the microphones, and we want to make sure that you're included in the discussion as you hear from our panelists. And Tim and John will have microphones to take questions from the audience as well. So thank you. Okay.
Thank you again, Tim. So I am going to start by asking the panelists what part of the history that you've heard tonight, or the remarks that Alona shared with us about history and truth-telling, how does that, what was most meaningful to you in your personal experiences as someone who was living through this time? All of you are younger than David Sindt, so it's a bit of a generational difference. But what really resonated with you in the presentation?
Well, I can start. One of the things that resonated for me is the incredible amount of courage and what deep faith David must have had to do what he did in the assembly, standing there with the sign proclaiming, everybody figured out that he was gay. Was there anybody else in the room that was gay with him? And I just marvel at that, in 1974, I was a sophomore in college and I was dealing with my sexuality, and I would never, ever would have done a public statement like that, because back in the 70s, it was scary to be gay. And it was, and especially when I started my elementary school teaching career, that, you couldn't be out. You had to protect yourself. You had to be in the closet. And it was just a really, really difficult time. And I just, I marvel that he was willing to step forward and start this whole process of people looking at inclusion and accepting of GLTB folks. I'm very thankful that he started the whole process.
Lisa?
That was just very moving to hear and experience. Lots of places where Tim said, then lots of things happened. That's where I came along. In the early 90s, so David Sindt had died. The people that I knew David. And I feel very much enveloped in the people who came before me, and had a kind of courage that I can only imagine. The other thing it just reminds me of is just the larger queer history. We were criminals, we were sick, and we were sinful. Those were the three legs of the stool, right? And so there were lots of people working in lots of places to dismantle each one of those weapons of destruction that were used to not only oppress us, but just but to kill us, sometimes. And I think about what's going on right now for in the trans community, and it's those same three methods of oppression. Saying something, you're criminal, you are sick, and you are sinful. That is what's going on right now. And the liberation struggle within the queer community for trans folks is so real and so horrifying to be, living through it again. So we got work to do. That's where I'm at.
Thank you. What resonated with me most is that I feel like I'm really humbled when I saw what everyone like David Sindt and all the LGBT members of the Presbyterian Church had to go through in the 70s, in the 80s, and even the early 90s. I'm very humbled because when I started coming out, this is like in the 90s, I actually have access to internet, and all these people, they don't have access to any resources, whatever. And that makes me really appreciative of what they have gone through. And in my work, I'm not I've told everybody, I'm not a ordained minister or whatever, I'm just a math professor. So, the thing I valued is that I'm really grateful at that time in the 90s, because even though I'm a college professor, I also was a faculty advisor of a GLBT group students. One of the things that resonated with me on these videos is that every single one of those slides have implications on how a person cannot be a Christian and GLBT at the same time. And when I saw what struggles my student had to go through, I started being proactive. And I'm really grateful to all the people I've known at More Like Presbyterians. And I want to give a shout out to two people I met. You may know them, Martha Julerad and Tammy Lindahl, both of whom were so helpful to me. And I even brought the shower of souls to campus just to, showcase to my students that, that there is hope. And I have to give a shout out to my former pastor at Dayton Avenue, who's the spouse of Ilona, and David Stewart was extremely helpful in terms of a resource person to me. So I stand on a lot of people's shoulders, and for that, I'm humble, I'm grateful. So.
Thank you, Pei. You've gone in a direction I was going to ask, which is about moments of joy through the struggle, because all three of you are still worshiping as Presbyterians in Presbyterian churches. Lisa, you are now Reverend Lisa Largess, and I love to say that. The fight for ordination and marriage equality was a long one, and it was incredibly painful, and that is just within the church polity, right? And these are all individual people with their own experiences in their congregations and experiencing different ways of being in community. Not all churches are as welcoming as Westminster. But I wanted to know, Terry and Lisa, Pei shared some moments of joy and community through that. Would you like to just put voice to that too? That's a great question.
Yes, means some joy, yeah. So, yes, when I was working with students and I helping them through the whole, yes, you can be both a Christian and GLBT. I mean, when I see joyful moments that they are able to reconcile that area, I mean, it was really, I mean, there's hope. I felt a sense of hope. So that's why, there's joy to it. And then on a side note, when my former pastor, I guess, David, he always tells me that, because I said, I'm still a Christian, I still belong to the Presbyterian Church, and I'm gay, yeah, I'm a lesbian, but the fact is I'm still in church, not in spite of it or because of it, but in spite of the church, I'm still a Christian. And so that bodes well for me. So.
Well, I guess my story, Rick and I were doing some church shopping. We had attended All God's Children Metropolitan Community Church for about 25 years. And at that time, it was a church that met our needs because it was a faith community of gay and lesbians, and we felt totally accepted there. What prompted us to go there was because we were doing some church shopping before you found All God's Children, and we were attending a Methodist church in town here, and we were really enjoying it and thought we might want to become members, but then because it was a very diverse congregation and a lot of young families, and we thought, well, an excellent music program. We thought, well, we could settle here. But then the pastor put this scathing letter on the front of his bulletins. It was during the AIDS crisis, and trying to say, don't let the media lift the blame of this horrible disease from the homosexual community. They are responsible for it. And we were just like floored, like, oh my gosh, where did this come from? Because he hadn't ever preached that from the pulpit. So we were concerned enough that we made an appointment to see the pastor and sat down and talked with him and went through why we were there and why we were upset and told him that we were thinking of becoming members of that church. And he said, well, now that, I'm glad you're here and I'm glad you shared this with me, because now that I know this, I can't allow you to be members of our church. And so we just packed up and left and went down the block where All God's Children was, and we were totally accepted there. And we were, very involved at that church for 25 years. But then, because you could really, be ourselves, and we didn't have to apologize for who we are, and we could, hold hands and be together and just be amongst people that were in the same challenge and same road of life that we were, and it was good. And then, but they started to change and become more. We enjoyed the more traditional kinds of services, and they became more contemporary and have a praise band, and just things were starting to change. And then we didn't feel the need to be just in that kind of exclusive community. So then we did another round of church shopping after that, and we're trying some different churches here in the Twin Cities, and kept coming back to Westminster. And, that it was just always a welcoming, we felt good to be here, and people valued us and were accepting of us. And so we decided to become members of Westminster, and then just really enjoying it. And then in August of 2013, I believe, the state of Minnesota made it possible that gays and GLBT folk could be legally married. And I just assumed that, and then Rick and I decided that January of 2014, it was going to be our 30th anniversary, how wonderful it would be to be legally married on that day. So we called the church, and there was a pause. They weren't quite sure, what to do with us at first, because we were the first ones, and the Presbytery still was working on that whole issue of allowing this. But I do have to commend Tim and Megan and Doug Mitchell at the time, who went to bat for us and made it possible that we were legally married here at Westminster. And it was just a wonderful, beautiful ceremony. It was full of joy and full of love, and we couldn't have asked for a better opportunity and to share that with the congregation here.
And Lisa?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, you know, what I remember is there's a ton of boredom. Yeah, general assemblies and committee meetings and this and that. And there's lots of fighting, lots of infighting, all that kind of stuff. But boy, there was a lot of laughing, you know. And I remember there was in the 90s, there was a thing called Presby Web. And if there was, we had kind of a bulletin board people would write in, and after Amendment B, it might have been before that, there was all this talk about a season of this, a season of that, and it just struck me as kind of ridiculous. So I wrote in just kind of a funny, I'll say, funny, very funny, I'll say, satire about all this season of this and that. Anyway, the next day, this woman responded to that and said, somebody who was part of Presbyterians for Renewal, so, you know, on the other side of things, and she's like, I didn't think gay people could be funny. And I was like, are you kidding me, sister? Like, you people are not the funny ones. Anyway, it was like this moment of like, crossing a bridge, you know, like where we both sort of saw each other as having the potential of humor, and like I always sort of wanted to like travel the country with her and do like stand-up comedy, and so that never worked out. But I mean, what I loved most about, one of the things I loved most about our community was just how darn funny, you know, way back in the, during the AIDS epidemic, you know, there was a protest in Los Angeles where a group of activists like chained themselves to, I don't remember what it was, a courthouse or front of a hospital, right? And so then the police had to come, and the police were all scared because they thought these people had AIDS, so they wore these bright yellow gloves, right? And so the chant was, your shoes don't match your gloves, your shoes don't match your gloves. Anyway, you know, it's like all of that, like, and just the resilience in all of that is just kind of what kept everybody going and keeps us going still. So, I mean, so the good news is like apparently there are funny people everywhere.
Thank you. I'm very glad that we were able to hear those experiences that brought joy and laughter, because we've been talking really about very recent history as these things go. You know, within the last 15 years, the polity of the Presbyterian Church USA changed to allow LGBTQ ordination and marriage equality. And that did bring a lot of joy at the time, and I think for at least several years afterward, but it has not somehow resolved this history. And Lisa, you alluded to the fact that we're in an environment right now where there are fairly powerful forces in the society and in various churches, maybe not so much as before in the Presbyterian Church USA, but in Christianity and Protestantism in this country, that are really behind trying to very much narrow the kind of history that people are able to learn about, that people that want to learn about different perspectives and different histories that have not traditionally been in history books are labeled as woke and denigrated. Do you have parting words before we open it up to the audience? Are we in another time of choosing, as Tim talked about? What is the role of the Presbyterian Church and just people in this country that care about making sure that documents history is as widely available as possible.
I can say my opinion on that. I think documenting all the evolution and all the trials that the PCUSA had gone through. Now, even as recently as 12 years ago when this amendment passed, there's still churches that I hear today, PCUSA, trying to get out of the congregation. So there's still struggle. So I think it's important to document that because even the people I met today, especially my students who are technically Gen Z or Gen Z plus or whatever it is, they may or may not know the kind of struggles the church went through. So for them to actually know about it and for the PHS, is that what to have that documentation, I think to me is kind of very important. That's crucial. So.
And I think it's really important for the Presbyterian denomination and the PCUSA to be models of acceptance, and that we can, especially with the transgender issues that are happening right now, and the restrictions of talking about being LGBTQ. I think that hopefully, more and more of our denominations will be the models of acceptance and encouragement and support for these folk.
Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember if it was Alona or Tim that said, histories are remembering and histories also are forgetting, like all of the stuff that we let be erased or intentionally erased. And so, I remember when I was probably 15 years out of seminary and began to start understanding the history of and the struggle of particularly African American Presbyterians, something I never knew anything about because I hadn't been told, didn't know it existed, right? Had the privilege to not know, right? So the work that PHS is doing now to work on the remember side and do the liberating work of challenging the erase side, because the erase side is going to be there. So things like this matter.
Okay, so we have some time for questions, and we do have microphones out in the audience, so you can ask a question of the panelists, of Tim. Yes, I see it. The first hand.
My name is Jim Brazel, and I'm a retired Presbyterian minister, and I want to speak about David in a different way. I was a JYA student with David in the Philippine Islands in 60-61. There were 3 of us who went to the Philippines that year as a part of the JYA program of the Presbyterian Church. And David and another JYA, a delightful young woman whose name I admit I no longer remember, they went to Silliman University, which is in the central Philippines, and I was at the University of the Philippines in Quezon City, a suburb of Manila. I simply want to add a note of sadness and respect for David. He struggled in our 3 days of orientation in San Francisco and 10 days that we were hosted by students at a university in Tokyo. He struggled with relationships with the people that he met. He struggled in his relationships, particularly with the young woman who was going to be his colleague at Silliman. And between Christmas and New Year's, I flew down to Silliman, and the first evening she took me out for a walk and wanted to say how difficult it was for her as other Filipino students were coming to her and complaining about the difficulty of finding good relationships with David. I simply want to say a note of sadness for what he went through. When you talk about his courage later, And my understanding is he didn't come out as gay until the early 70s. This is 10 plus years before that. But David endured through that, and I have a great deal of respect for him because I saw firsthand the struggle that he had as a younger university age person, and I felt a great deal of sadness for him as well as respect. And I think that part of his life deserves some acknowledgement as well. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks to the panelists and Tim Hoogland, thanks. I want to direct the question to Alona, if that's okay. You talked about the many changes that, the whole panel, but you talked about polity. And I'm interested in how polity moving forward can be more justice-facing, or all the things that you talked about. Because this is a conversation about many things, and it's a conversation about polity.
Well, we could do a week-long lecture on this, but a couple of things I'll start with. Of course, Robert's Rules of Order came out of a parliamentary procedure at the center of empire. You know, and it was a matter of who had agency in the justice system, who could speak, who was recognized. Sovereignty, of course, was something that didn't exist within indigenous communities. So again, if we are able to visit how we make decisions, how we come to agreement through disagreement and then negotiated procedures, Robert's Rules, not that we need to toss it out, but we need to understand its origin and what that has done for people's identities around the world. There was an expectation that that kind of sovereign court system applied through the church would be part of a requirement for people around the world, indigenous people especially, to stop being indigenous and to become Christian. You know, so that would be the first thing. I think the other awareness is with our polity. The General Assembly is a very dynamic experience of people engaging together on issues that emerge at the congregational and the presbytery level. But our list of actions continues to just grow and grow because people see it as a theater in order to make changes. And I would say, again, some decision-making in other cultures is that everybody gets a chance to speak, but you don't continue that negotiation to be able to say, let's revise that in the next 2 years. You know, so again, I think around, you know, if we look at our Book of Order and the changes that are made, I think we're becoming much more inclusive by having people serve on committees and, you know, be representative in their leadership. But historically, we do need to know what was the origin of all of that. And it wasn't an indigenous worldview, nor was it a worldview that recognized that colonial empire required so much of people in order to become Christian. You either did that or you died. And so our polity really came at a huge sacrifice to people who wanted to be active in a response to Christ's message, but the message had to come through the church. And that's part of the difficulty. But there's so much more I could talk about, but those are just a couple of things.
Thank you. Thanks. Lisa, I wanted to tell you that you're one of those stars from the 90s that I looked up to. I thought I wanted to go to seminary. I attended United for 1 semester and decided I needed to put my energy into coming out instead and feeling accepted. So I was in and out of the Presbyterian. I've been in and out of the Presbyterian Church for 25 years, in and out of Westminster for 25 years, and something always pulls me back. And one of the things I want to ask you is, how do you deal with the lingering feelings, I'm assuming you might have, of being referred to as someone said, like as a specimen through so many of these General Assembly meetings? You know, the information in here that refers to genitalia, you know, things like that I feel are just so condescending. And those are some of the things that are the hardest for me to forgive.
And I couldn't hear quite the end of your question about General Assemblies, and Nancy, could you get it? Can you repeat it?
Yes, so she is wondering if you could speak to lingering feelings you have about how you were treated, referred to like a specimen, an object, during a lot of those years when, you know, people were characterizing gay people, lesbian people as other and as people that we are going to talk about, not be in communion with. So is that a good enough?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that you and I have the same views, right? I'm just assuming there might be some feelings you carry even after many, many years of being ordained.
Well, thanks. I mean, and I'm sure Pay and Terry can speak to some of this too, and kind of living through that history, not just in the church, but beyond it too. I mean, I will tell you, you know, I carry my own scars, and I work on healing every day. I mean, I love who I am. I love my life. I love Lake Nokomis Church, and but you know, being involved in the broader church, I just so not ready yet. You know, because like that healing is still happening, and I think that experience of being othered, especially within the church, you know, where it's not just something about you, but it's your very being that is like sinful and evil and tearing the church. You know, it gets to a person after a while. And boy, you know, gosh, there's so many beautiful people who felt the burn of that in ways that were so deeply destructive, right? And then the other experiences reminds me of, you know, kind of all these court cases that we went through, and they were all cases against the presbytery for actions the presbytery took, so they were all about me, but I was not an agent in the case. So I would go to all these court cases where they would be talking about Lisa Largess, and I'd be like, I'm right here, I can hear you, you know. Anyway, so like that was just like one of those weird like things that the church does, in the way that it, I mean, in that oppression does too, but that the church, because it holds spiritual power, is especially good at, and incredibly dangerous for that reason. Pay and Terry, anybody, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
I think I want to end the Q&A here, but I know that I believe most of us will still be around after this is over. I just want to say how proud I am that the Presbyterian Historical Society is able to highlight this history. It is a work in progress for us. We want to collect in many forms voices and experiences within the church and from the larger society that impacts the church. On the back of the programs is our new mission statement, and we want to be an active ministry to the denomination and to the society and culture that we all are in. And so being just a repository is very important because we collect the documents like Tim highlighted in order to tell stories, but we want to tell those stories. And we depend on people out there like you all and around the denomination to help us tell those stories. So I would welcome hearing from you all. We are in this together, I believe, and it's only together that we are really going to fully live with, and understand and go forward with this history. I want to ask Libby Shannon to give us a closing prayer and benediction. So Libby is the transitional executive presbyter, general presbyter, sorry, with the Twin Cities area presbytery. So.
Okay, and while Libby comes up, don't forget your surveys. Remember, everything that we told you today is illegal in the state of Florida.
And as a refugee from Florida, thanks for having me. Beloved friends, in the telling of our story, may we be more faithful. In the listening to our siblings, may we hear with greater clarity. In the sharing of our lives, may we be more generous. In the walking toward justice, may we forge a smoother path. In throwing open the doors, may we not just allow, but invite. Not just notice, but honor. Not just include, but celebrate. In the seeking of dignity, truth, and wholeness, may we know fully, live fully, and receive fully the love of the God who declares us beloved. Gracious and loving God, as we go out into this night, shield the joyous, protect the proud, reassure the unsure, all for your love's sake. Amen.